Well, we've heard a lot of stimulating ideas in this panel this afternoon, and I think in the second part of our panel, we'll allow the speakers to speak to each other. So if you have comments that you would like to direct to each other, I think now's the moment to do that. And then we'll turn the floor over to the audience who can ask questions and make comments. So anybody want to jump in?
I was thinking, Randy, as you launched this evisceration of transculturalism. Yeah, a little bit. And I was thinking about how this Bourne's transnationality links up with transculturalism. Yeah, I thought you might. That's why I'm bringing it up before you did. And I think what is different about transnationalism in Bourne's formulation is that he really did see this as a process that went beyond the border, that was continually reinvigorated by the connections that immigrants have with the rest of the world, with their homelands. I mean, he saw this as a kind of opportunity of world peace, that this would become Wilson's talking about a League of Nations. He's arguing that we already have a League of Nations. It's called the United States of America. So that's my preemptive.
Well, it's an ideal and it's lovely.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But of course, if you don't have the infrastructure to put the ideal into reality, it ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
And that, in my mind, has never happened.
Yeah.
And that's what it's about. And that's why I'm probably fed up with the diaries. And I say it's like a continuous circle that we go into. We have to move beyond that somehow.
Yeah.
I think Grace was sort of meaning that as well. So, your ideals and their realities. Okay? And you've got to have.
And this is an ideal, no question. But I think it offers us as historians a different way to think about how to investigate immigration.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking transculturalism was somehow reinvented recently as
right.
This new thing that came out. Well, it didn't. And I knew that. I knew that.
Yeah.
Most people probably know that. That kind of idea has been around a long time. But, everything comes around. Moves around, comes around. So.
No one else?
Everybody here from the audience.
Yeah. Okay, let's open.
Yeah. Sorry, I have a few comments, questions. First, a small one, mostly to my dear friend Randy, whose work I admire enormously. But when you start to insert in your presentation, which I appreciate, I like the whole notion of transculturalism, I felt once again how in Canada we have the two solitudes. It has happened to me many times. I live in Quebec. I teach in French university. And the reason I say that is because in 1982-83, a cultural magazine was formed, was created in Montreal, which was called Vice Versa, a transcultural magazine, Vice Versa, transcultural magazine, and it went on until '96. And during those 14-15 years, it was at the center of intellectual and artistic interaction in Quebec, primarily Montreal, around the notion of transculture, and as a criticism to multiculturalism, to Canadian multiculturalism. And now one can say, what impact did that have on the policy? I say very little. But what impact did it have on literary creation, on cinema? Where else in Canada at the time, or even in the States, except maybe New York, would you find a place where French-Canadian writers, artists, Italians, Germans, Latin American would converge, write, interact in their own language, and then let that ferment all over the cultural milieu. So that, I think, of course, now, there have been many people outside Canada who have discovered that heritage, and I've written MA theses in Germany, France, and Italy about that experience, which still has important roots. But to me, when I heard you talk about that, and I say that very, very friendly, and I felt again as experiencing the Toussaint.
Yeah, and actually, the first
And
draft.
by the way, now it's all online. The whole collection of vice versa
Yeah.
is online.
I-
Anybody can.
I actually knew that, and actually, in my first draft, I was going to talk about the Quebec, but we had 12 minutes or whatever.
No, I know.
Absolutely. And I started talking about transculturalism with these are the strengths or perceived
Yeah.
strengths, and then these are the perceived weaknesses. It's problematic to me, but it's both good and bad. But what bothers me is, I guess, that it has been appropriated by groups, either businesses or governments or culture groups who want to, who have some kind of driving mission,
Yeah.
whatever that may be. Whether it's to produce a mainstream culture to sell products, whether it's to maintain or to produce kind of an ideal that somehow transcends differences that everyone can grab onto, or whatever. And it's that potentially dangerous side that I think that's what I'm trying to draw people's
Yeah.
attention to. It could be potentially good in an ideal world, but it has a power behind it that can be used that's divisive. Did you understand what I'm saying? So-
Yeah. Especially, it's a good point because when the notion came among the people who founded vice versa and kept working on it and attracting artists, and it was experience-based. As Gramsci says, it was a praxis. It was a cultural practice. It was not a theory that came from Bourne or from Roundtable. Because in Montreal, we felt, those people felt, was a trust culture. A trust-cultural phenomena were happening every day in the
Right.
bus line, in the autobus, in the cinema.
Where else could it happen but Montreal?
So it was based on a real
Yeah.
experience, and in that sense, it had a certain
But you go outside,
breeze.
you go outside Montreal though, where is that kind of
Yeah,
synergy?
of course.
That synergy arguably is not the same outside Montreal as in the rest of Quebec or the rest of Canada or the rest of North America. Montreal is kind of a unique island in many ways, and maybe that synergy there. But arguably, it could also happen in Europe or other places as well. It's interesting. And,
Yeah, but my other comment was really more directed to David, if I may, David, Kazal, and Patricia. Is it Patricia your first name? Good? You remember?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
I know.
yeah.
Yes.
And
It's a lot of years.
has to do with the way you talk about multiculturalism in the American context. And I have no qualms with what you said, but. And here I was struck by the fact that in many ways, in different ways, the three of you were doing the history of an idea, which is okay. I mean, this is one of the early fields of history was history of ideas, when we were graduate students. But if multiculturalism is studied as a social movement, which in many ways it has been in the States, particularly in the 70s and 80s, following the crisis of identity after the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, a social movement which allowed minorities to come to the open and to be and to seek for empowerment. And when I talk about minorities, I don't just mean ethnocultural minorities, because there's a key difference between the two, multiculturalism and social movements across the border. If we talk of multiculturalism as a movement, then we have to really use different criteria of discussion analysis, because there you can see that in that case, multiculturalism in the States had a very much more important role, in my view, than multiculturalism here, which was parachuted by the government, and here. Is Ken gone? Ken McCormick?
Yes.
Oh, because I mean, he's one of the key persons who studied the context in which the political strategy behind the mise en vigueur of multiculturalism here in Canada, a very clear strategy vis-à-vis Quebec and all that. So as a social movement, and I'm speaking here not as a historian of ideas, but as a historian of social movements, then American multiculturalism of the 70s, 80s, 90s is very, very important because it allowed all these minorities, homosexual, women first of all, women, gays. No, I mean, in the language of political science, sorry, I don't want to offend the women. It's far from me to do that. People who know me, they know very well that I'm not one of those people. But I'm talking in the way the official language talks about minority groups, right? I don't have to explain that, I hope. So the feminist movement, okay, the women movement, the gay movement, the black movement, as well as the new immigrants who are seeking for a voice, etc. So in that sense, I think there the transnational dimension becomes more clear. The link between multiculturalism and transnational becomes much more clear than if we just do the history of ideas of pluralism. That's all I want to say. And in fact, I want to ask whether there is a way to combine those two. And also because the third link, the link that David thought was missing in the case of Americanization in the States was mass culture.
Yeah.
Mass culture, which really Americanized, and that's capitalism. It's the most sophisticated form of capitalism that Americanized immigrants in the 20s particularly started to return. So I'll stop there because I've spoken too much.
I'm ready to jump out of my seat, but I think, I've given this a lot of thought with sort of how do you conceptualize what multiculturalism is, because it's such a fuzzy concept, particularly in the US. And that's why I like to use the term ideology, because ideology can have multiple dimensions. You can talk about it in terms of ideas, you can talk about it, but also in terms of the social reach of those ideas. You can talk about it in terms of institutionalizations of ideas in terms of the state, and also in the American context with affirmative action. And you can talk about it in terms of movements, right? It gives you several dimensions, or a place to talk about different dimensions of those ideas, how they work themselves out socially, and how they perhaps get integrated into the structures of power. So I'm very much interested in doing that, to try and capture that. I don't know how well it works, but I hope it works to some degree. I do want to stress, though, too, well, just to mention, that in trying to historicize this, it's important also to remember or to look into those cases where it isn't simply ethno-racial. LA is a wonderful example of this. LA has perhaps the world's first homosexual rights society, the Vanishing Society, founded in 1950 by Harry Hay. Daniel Hurwitz makes a really good argument that Harry Hay borrows explicitly from Popular Front and especially Communist Party notions of interracialism when he crafts a notion of a homosexual identity that you can then rally around and defend and advance. And in fact, Hay comes out literally out of the same neighborhoods as people like Carrie McWilliams. He's deeply involved in the CP. And he, as Hurwitz says, basically reworks notions of pluralism so that they're not just for ethno-racial groups, but they're specifically for what he calls the homosexual minority in the United States. And it's a transformative moment. It's also interesting that it's continuity, right? Because Vanishing continues to exist into the 70s. It's a very important part of the gay rights movement as it gets launched. It's a mass movement in the 70s. And the people involved in that, Harry Hay gets tossed out at a certain point, but the people involved in that are bringing out ideas from the 50s. So there's a way in which there's a history of this. It's also about sexual minorities. And I couldn't help but try and do that.
Okay, and then Patricia.
I wanted to make several comments. I'm dipping out of my seat too, but I'll limit myself to two. One is I disagree that there's no social history of multiculturalism in Canada before the policy, and that that multiculturalism is something that's parachuted by the government. If only because, first of all, what gives rise to it is a very organized, concerted effort on part of at least one community, Ukrainian Canadians, to sort of get that extra chapter into the Royal Commission, right, about bilingualism and biculturalism. And I don't think that comes out of nowhere, right? I don't think there's the same kind of concerted effort of all the different groups, but I think you can see in several, especially immigrant communities, these kind of articulations. And this is, I think, this kind of ripple effect from the history that I was talking about earlier too, where you have all at the same time, expressions, assertions of, and yet frustrations with two solitudes idea, right? And you have that splintering in terms of scales of, sort of Trudeau federalism and Levesque provincial or sovereignty kind of movement, right? But it's the same kind of, it's grappling with the same thing and a very real history of discrimination, right? And so it's seeking power and political manifestations in these ways. Anglo-Canadians, especially in Ontario, react to that with another articulation of nationalism. Those who don't have that background react to that. And that Anglo-Canadian nationalism, just to throw in another one, articulates itself very much in relationship to the United States and anti-Americanism and puts that in the middle of it. So those who don't share that background react to that with these other articulations. It's not a neat and tidy process, but there's definitely some intention behind it and some organized and sometimes very articulate. And I remember vice versa. I think that's actually where you find it too, is in literature and cultural expressions, rather than kind of political movements prior to 1971. But having said that, I also want to rein in, sort of more broadly, the idea that we always know what we're doing. And I've written about this too, that a lot of Canada's so-called success, I didn't pick up on this comment, with multiculturalism, is particular to geography and circumstance and urban, right? Urban centers like Montreal, like Los Angeles, Winnipeg actually should have been in there somewhere, Toronto, particular circumstances, particular constellations, and so on, and things emerge, but a lot of it's accidental, and then you discover, hey, that actually works, let's keep going. But I think it's actually important to remember that these things then take on, mythological proportions, but they aren't always as organized as they look like when we look back at them. So, good caveat. Anyway, I'll stop there.
So first I want to jump real quick on what you're saying here. As Angelina, myself, it's so nice to hear they talk about it in some kind of positive light. And the Silver Lake neighborhood you're talking about in particular being, to bring back one of the keywords from this workshop, a real borderlands in a lot of different directions. I guess part of my concern, I'm listening to all this talk about multiculturalism, transculturalism, and so right away I'm thinking Raymond Williams, right? And I'm thinking about what is this word that we're using when we're talking about culture, right? Which is already one of the most kind of floating signifiers we can whip out. And how did that work with transnationalism? And I'm only really comfortable talking about transnationalism in the context of nation states, which are these entities that we can point at, right? So working with my immigrants, I can say, they were transnational migrants, they were going from Italy to the United States, they're doing these things, right? But in many ways I was thinking of them as translocal migrants, and they're moving from very particular location to very particular locations. I have a real problem calling them Italians. And a real problem when we start talking about cultures in some kind of homogenized manner, right? And it seems like all these different kinds of transnational, transcultural, multiculturalisms still kind of in some way reify an idea of homogenized cultures that are coming together. And it's the Italian culture mixing with the German culture, mixing with American culture in some kind of way it hasn't seemed to really exist and connect to people. So if there's, I was wondering, when we're trying to talk about multiculturalism in a workshop that's both transnational and borderlands, it seems that when we start going into the waters of culture, that borderlands might actually have a spot where we can say some interesting things, because one of the things that borderlands allows us to see is the mixing of diverse and divergent cultural traditions. So I don't know if you can say anything about that, but the dangers of assuming homogenized cultures from sending nations, and also how borderlands can fit into this conversation.
Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
just quickly, I think, I'm a historian. Historically, if you look at these notions from Randall, well, even Bourne, but from Boris Callan forward through intercultural education in the 20s and 30s, through even a fair amount of interracial stuff, even on the left in LA and elsewhere, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, up through multiculturalism in the States in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Yeah, one of the things it does is it reifies cultures. It actually, in order to pin it down, part of it is, and it's part of reflection of identity politics, you need to have some kind of essentialized identity to point to, right, in order to make the whole thing kind of work. There's so many moving parts to it that that's one place to pin it down. And it does historically tend to do that. I mean, in those conversations, that's what happens. I think a lot of the frustration, and you can see this frustration in the 1920s and in the 40s as well as now, with these notions, is it does seem too binding. It seems too limiting. It doesn't really get at. And I must say, someone like Karen Williams recognizes this in LA, in the 40s specifically, that there's something it doesn't quite capture, because it does essentialize it.
I was just going to add that sort of absolutely, and particularly in the way that immigration has this way, in the dynamic of the settlement process, has this way of inventing or reinventing national identities around the groups that come, and they don't necessarily come with that identity, that group, and they don't even necessarily know each other as they share that same space. Absolutely.
Can I just jump in? You might be interested in reading a book that came out in 2008 called Beyond Walls by Victor Conrad and Heather Nichol. One of the chapters in the book is devoted to the history of the borderlands. But they put a particular emphasis on cultural hybridization and the culture of borderlands, and they address some of the concerns you have. You might get something from that book.
I've been trying to think through it also because I work with print culture and the critiques of Habermas as public and counter-publics, and as a way to try to think through that the kind of diversities of cultures instead of going into assuming some kind of unified public from any sending community or any receiving community, but allowing that diversity. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, all your papers talk about the genealogy of multiculturalism, pluralism, transculturalism, and so on. Now, wondering about the concept of cosmopolitanism. Is that something that you find, does that come up as a strong alternative view to either self-identification? I guess in my research, I do find sometimes immigrants who tend to be educated elites that use that sense of cosmopolitanism to sort of basically identify themselves as citizens of the world, of the Western democracy, the Republican state. So is that something that...
I'll jump in there. Quite a few years ago now, there was a geographer, or a group of geographers, who did this weird study where they came up with something called the Index of Cosmopolitanism. Remember that? And the city in the world that was the most cosmopolitan was this, Toronto. And part of their argument is what you're saying, is that here we have people who are, we have a multicultural society, we're supposedly official multicultural society, but here we have a particular geographical setting where those boundaries that are the problem of multicultural society, the balkanization and all that stuff, have been somehow transcended through sort of horizontal links. And that has created another layer of identity. You identify yourself as an Italian Torontonian, an Italian Canadian, an Italian, a Canadian, but at the same time you sort of say, I'm a citizen of the world. And that's what came out of that. So that's a potential, that's an interesting point you make. But does that transcend all groups in society or all groups in the city? I don't think so. I think you're quite right. It's something that maybe an elite would grasp onto that concept, but I don't think it filters all the way down. So.
But, I mean, excuse me for intervening as chair, I shouldn't be doing it. It seems to me that if that were the case, Bruno's point about transculturalism would have a physical manifestation in Toronto. I don't see it. So, anyway. Yes.
You have your hand up first.
I'm sorry, I'm a very poor chair.
I might actually stand up. I'm much higher. I have a question about the approaching the myth of the melting pot historically. And I think, I just want to set it up first of all, it might sort of sound like an attempt at group therapy, but I think one of the things we recognize, we've long recognized that the melting pot was a myth. historically, but we still have to recognise the power of it, especially Anglo-Americanness, the power of the melting pot, for our historical context and our historical subject. And so I think we grapple with using it without falling into the myth itself and accepting it for ourselves. Perhaps we haven't got out of that. And so, one of the things we try to do is regard the idea as an historical artifact in itself. So that's sort of what we're talking about. So with that in mind, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how our historical subjects measure the success or failure of the melting pot. What are their measures? Are they language, learning English? Is it the social mobility, education of children, or is it the acquisition of legal citizenship? Is that a definitive measure for our historical subject? And then how do we sort of assess or critique these measures from what we hope is a vantage point that's outside of the hegemony of the myth? Does that make sense?
Question?
Well, I can sort of address that in the contemporary. As a former, an Angelino, I'm now living in State College, Pennsylvania, but that's another issue in itself. And trained in Chicano Latino studies. We take a look at ethnic peoples in the United States as, I think, from the vantage point of an evolving community, and a community that goes through, certain scales of development, economic mobility, linguistic acquisition, etc., and there is a coming to be of these communities. But the case really is in reverse when you look at Latinos or Mexicans in particular in the Southwest, where the community now is majority immigrant, where there is not this assimilative sort of gradual Americanization, if you will, of that particular community. So the barometers of the success of multiculturalism are actually ironically in reverse. We see the backlash of the acceptance of these communities as non-acceptance, and we see that written into state law, beginning in California in 1994 with Proposition 187, and then the attacks on affirmative action. Interestingly, in Arizona, the attack on immigrants began before the attack on Mexican Americans and their education in that state of Arizona. But this is a very interesting historical continuity, where we see states really taking reins of immigration policy and attacking immigrants, and then education and freedom of speech, or vice versa. And we see that, very clear in terms of the examples of Latino communities in the Southwest in the last 30 years. So the chimera of multiculturalism is alive, and these barometers for success. We really have to, again, come up with different notions of understanding ethnicity in the United States as well as in Canada. I could speak much less and much proficiently for the Canadian examples, but it sounds like there's a lot of historical continuities rather than privileges.
If I could add to that, just it's so highly contextualized that the idea of measuring it immediately makes me uncomfortable. And I think your example, the context in which there are very practical aspects, right, for anyone settling, whether it's transnational or translocal, moving from one place to another, that their own sense of satisfaction, between two different people, could look, diametrically opposed. And I think I make these comments thinking about the kind of, I guess, mostly sociological research that has tried to measure this. I think it's a big book on identity. It looked at, how much a group intermarried and how much a group married out, and took these as measures of this or that. And, some of those are measures of coincidence, and measures of opportunity, and they're not necessarily measures of satisfaction. They aren't, again, what something looks like on the outside is not necessarily what it actually is on the inside. And so I think these are things we need to think through, and yet not, and then maybe stop right short of establishing measurement. Yeah.
If I can say quickly, I think historically you have to ask who's doing the measuring. If you ask a progressive capital P reformer in 1912, if you talk to a factory owner in 1916, how do they measure the melting pot? They're going to tell you, all right, up to what degree does my workforce learn English? And what's the rate of acquiring citizenship? And that's what they're going to measure by. And some progressives are much better than others. I'm not casting down on Jane Addams or certainly Randall. But, you know, that the Americanizers, as in fact some call themselves, are to use those kinds of measures to say how successful is the melting pot, how successful is the organization. I don't know what you do with that information, but you can certainly find it in this. I mean, there's plenty of evidence about those sort of acquisitions.
I guess my thought is sort of, as historians, how do we, if it makes us uncomfortable, the measures make us uncomfortable, but how do we sort of treat our subjects as objectively as possible when those measures are sort of so volatile today?
I agree with you totally that that's not our job, right? Our job is not to impose our current cultural value of the melting pot onto our historical actors when we're assessing them. Our job is to take them seriously, that they believed in it. From my perspective as a historian, it mattered to them, it had power to them. So I'll take that on its own terms.
But it makes for uncomfortable writing, right?
No, absolutely. I've written a lot of things that I kind of, little Clockwork Orange moment.
Well, you look at, you look at again, the population of Latinos and Mexicans in the Southwest, the whole notion of melting pot and that ideology is near absent because of the going back and forth and the transmigration and the dislocation created through, a few decades of Great Depression, et cetera, and movements back and forth. So those notions are I think, define certain communities, perhaps, but are completely absent in others.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question.
Okay, I'm sorry to take the last question. I was thinking about this genealogy of multiculturalism, and you went as far south as LA, but I would encourage us to go farther south and think about Latin America as a genealogy for some of these ideas. And I'm thinking about Jose Marti's anti-racist ideas of racial democracy in Cuba, Jose Vasconcelos in Mexico in the 1920s, and the person who coins the term transculturation is, of course, Fernando Ortiz in 1940 in Cuba. And what is interesting about understanding the genealogy of these ideas is that even though this idea of mestizaje was based in opposition to this the racism in the United States and Europe, pretty much now it's accepted, at least among Latin Americans, that the notion and the ideology of mestizaje is deeply racist. And when I looked at that monument in 1954, it looks like the Diego Rivera murals that were done on Vasconcelos' order of the he had 4 pillars of humanity based on this sort of aesthetic idea of eugenics, and all the beautiful people were going to mix and produce this master race. So I see, I want to believe in this positive sort of what can we rescue from multiculturalism, but I wonder the extent to which the language, even of hybridity, this language comes out of eugenics. And then in the after eugenics gets discredited, it very quickly switches over to cultural language and essentialized cultural language. But it actually maintains some of those essentialist and I think racist notions within it. And so your discussion of sort of multiculturalism as this positive thing maybe that we could rescue and talk about colorblindness from the political context of the United States right now, at least from where I sit, multiculturalism is totally bankrupt. It's something that has been completely co-opted by corporations and university administrators to not deal with serious power issues. And just one more thing, you're right, in this last week, the whole colorblindness argument was what was used by the student at the University of Texas to argue against affirmative action. So I feel like the colorblindness, all of these arguments are precisely the problem for us, at least in the United States.
I really have to jump in here and say I'm not trying to basically have an excavation project, rescue what's good about multiculturalism and use it today. I'm treating this historically. And I don't think it's dead in the United States as an ideal to the extent maybe some people think, although I think it's sort of on short rations. But I'm trying to figure out what's the development of this notion, how does it work, and it's full of contradictions and complexities. And it's, I could go into the monument, but Ford wanted to put a museum of each race at the foot of each statue, right? And it boggles the mind to think, what would you put in the museum, right? The white guy, but there's all sorts of different contradictions to this, I think, especially. But I'll just quote one of my students in my seminar, grad seminar on pluralism. At the end of it, we said, I said, what do you think of multiculturalism? And there was silence, and then she said, well, it's better than Jim Crow. I mean, there's that. So, anyway.
And can I just quickly pick up on that and to answer this and also answer your question about the three guys I've been thinking about, these Americanization projects, but also to come back to the question about cosmopolitanism and where it is, that there are often inherent contradictions and ambivalences that we don't want. Like you want to be either or, for this or against that, and so on. No, it's the empire, American, British, Russian, grew out and inherently, by practice, right, diversified the landmass being governed, or landmasses, in a way that was desired by the metropole and yet not wanted by the metropole, because it tended to then bring the diversity home to the metropole in a way that it didn't want. Like these are happening at the same time in the same practices, but there isn't a singular attitude towards them, right? So they're complicated in terms of being able to even take a hard, fast stand on another one. The contradictions and ambivalences.
Well, I think what we're losing here in the 21st century in terms of multiculturalism is really the role and the important role of historically underrepresented peoples in the United States. And the conflation of these folks with international individuals who come here and don't have a shared struggle of history, of exploitation, of Jim Crowism, of racism that historically underrepresented students have. And institutionally, there is a movement away of providing provisions and inclusion in terms of institutions for historically underrepresented peoples in substitution for international individuals. And this is the new multiculturalism in the United States and on college campuses. And I think that's, it's telling, and I think it needs to be challenged.
I would say historically too, when I had Randolph Bourne in mind, I was thinking of it as a methodology more than as a reflection of reality. But when I think about the one historian who's actually done that, I'm thinking of Kristen Hogan's book, Consumers Imperium, where she's looking at how Americans receive global currents and exchanges and all the rest of it. And of course, the argument she makes is they appropriate it, turn it into empire, and so the one example I can think of where historians use methodology is again a contradiction. It bites back. It has a life of its own, right? So absolutely, it does.
Well,